I handed in my resignation on a Tuesday afternoon in March, sitting across from David Sullivan in the small glass office he'd claimed when he joined the firm 2 years ago. The letter was typed, professional, dated. I'd worked on the phrasing for 3 days, revising it each night after dinner, trying to find language that sounded confident without sounding bitter, decisive without sounding reactive. After careful consideration of my career goals and the evolving needs of the firm, I have decided to pursue opportunities that better align with my professional development. The kind of language that sounded like autonomy, like I was moving towards something, not away from something. David read it twice, slowly, his eyes tracking across each line with the careful attention he brought to everything. Then he set it down on the desk between us, aligned it precisely with the edge of his notebook, and looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or was it satisfaction? I respect your decision, he said finally. You've always known what you wanted, Emily. That's one of the things I've always admired about you. I believed him. More importantly, I believed myself. The decision had felt inevitable for weeks, months maybe. I was 34 years old, senior enough to matter in the organization, but not senior enough to have real authority over direction or strategy. The firm was restructuring, a process that had been ongoing since David joined, and my role had been evolving. A word David used often in our one-on-ones. Evolving away from direct client contact, evolving toward more administrative support functions, evolving into something I hadn't trained for, hadn't wanted, and couldn't see a future in. Leaving felt like the only move that preserved my dignity, the only choice that let me maintain the narrative that I was in control of my own career. David stood when I did. He walked me to the elevator, which felt like a gesture of respect at the time. He shook my hand, holding it just a moment longer than necessary, his grip warm and firm. You're going to do great things, Emily. You always have. I have no doubt you'll land somewhere that truly values everything you bring to the table. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months, the pressure that had been sitting on my chest, making it hard to breathe deeply, making it hard to sleep. It had lifted. I was free. I was moving forward. I was making a choice. The firm was Anderson Mitchell Consulting, a mid-sized strategy group that specialized in organizational redesign for nonprofits and mission-driven companies. Foundations, advocacy organizations, social enterprises. It was the kind of work that attracted people who wanted to believe their careers meant something beyond profit margins. We helped organizations become more efficient, more effective, more aligned with their missions. We restructured teams, redesigned workflows, created strategic plans that supposedly transformed how our clients operated. I'd been there for 9 years, longer than anyone except Robert Anderson, the founder. Robert had started the firm 15 years ago, built it from nothing into something with real influence in the sector. He was in his mid-50s, quiet and thoughtful, the kind of person who asked good questions and then actually listened to the answers. I'd always respected him, even admired him. He'd hired me straight out of graduate school, took a chance on me when I had credentials but no real experience, and he'd supported my growth throughout my time at the firm. I'd started as a junior analyst doing background research and data compilation for senior staff. Within 2 years, I was leading my own client assessments. By year 5, I was managing mid-sized engagements with minimal oversight. By year 7, I had developed specialized expertise in organizational culture work, not just restructuring teams on paper, but understanding the informal systems and relationships that actually determined how organizations functioned. I'd built real relationships with clients. They requested me specifically for their projects. They trusted me, until gradually they didn't anymore. Or rather, they didn't get the chance to. David Sullivan had joined as director of operations 26 months before I resigned. He came from a larger firm, one of the big national consultancies, and he brought with him a polish and efficiency that Robert said were exactly what we needed as we scaled. The firm had grown quickly, maybe too quickly, and our internal systems were straining. We needed someone who could professionalize our operations, create real structure, make us function like a serious organization rather than a scrappy startup that had gotten lucky. David seemed perfect for the role. He was 42, composed, articulate. He had a way of making you feel seen, valued. He remembered details about your life, your partner's name, your hobbies, the vacation you'd mentioned in passing 3 months ago. He asked follow-up questions. He sent articles he thought you'd find interesting. He made you believe that the firm's success was inseparable from your own, that your contributions mattered, that he was invested in your development. Within 6 months, David had restructured the entire team. Roles were redefined, responsibilities redistributed. Reporting lines shifted. Some people who'd reported to Robert now reported to David instead, and some people who'd reported to senior staff now reported to Robert, which meant effectively that they reported to no one because Robert was too busy with business development to provide real oversight. David said it was about creating clearer accountability, about ensuring everyone had appropriate levels of responsibility. Several longtime employees left during this period, by choice officially. They all said similar things. The work had changed, the culture felt different. They wanted something that better aligned with their values or their career trajectories. It was time for a change. They'd been thinking about it anyway. I didn't see the pattern. I saw individuals making individual decisions for individual reasons. People left jobs all the time. Consulting had high turnover. It was normal. My role changed gradually enough that I didn't notice it was changing until it had already changed completely. It started with David asking me to take on coordination for a major client pitch we were developing, organizing materials, scheduling stakeholder meetings, managing the logistics of the proposal process. It was temporary, he said, just until we landed the contract. The pitch was for a large foundation, potentially 6 figures of work, and David wanted everything to be perfect. He said my attention to detail and my understanding of client needs made me the ideal person to quarterback the process. It felt like trust, like recognition of my abilities. I said yes. The pitch process consumed 3 weeks. I coordinated schedules across multiple time zones, compiled research documents, formatted presentations, ensured every detail was managed. We won the contract. David praised my work in the team meeting, said the proposal wouldn't have succeeded without my coordination. Everyone applauded. Then he asked me to manage the onboarding process for the contract, setting up systems, creating templates, establishing protocols for the engagement. Also temporary, he said, just until we had the infrastructure in place. Then he asked me to train the new hires, walk them through our methodologies and processes. That was a compliment, he said. It meant he trusted my judgment, valued my institutional knowledge. The new staff would benefit from learning directly from someone who embodied the firm's values. Each request sounded reasonable in isolation. Each one sounded like he was valuing my skills, my experience, my judgment. Then he stopped inviting me to client meetings. I noticed the absence first. I'd arrive at the office and see that there was a client meeting scheduled, something I would normally have attended, should have attended given my role and expertise, and I wasn't on the invitation. The first few times I assumed it was an oversight. David was managing a lot of moving pieces. People forgot to CC people sometimes, but it kept happening. When I finally asked him about it directly, David leaned back in his chair, with that thoughtful expression he always wore when he was about to say something that sounded caring. I want to protect your time, Emily. You're stretched thin with all the internal work you're managing. Let me handle the external relationships while you focus on keeping the engine running internally. That's where you're providing the most value right now. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like care, like he was looking out for my well-being, preventing me from burning out. I said yes. By the time I resigned, I'd been doing primarily administrative work for 4 months straight, scheduling meetings, filing and organizing project documentation, coordinating travel arrangements for client site visits I wasn't attending, reviewing junior analysts' draft reports and reformatting them into David's preferred templates, work I'd done in my 2nd year at the firm, not my 9th. But I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was being a team player, that every organization needed people willing to do the unglamorous work that kept things running. I told myself that when the restructuring settled, when the new systems were established, when the new staff were fully onboarded, my role would expand again. I'd get back to client work. I'd get back to the strategic work I'd trained for, the work I was good at. It didn't happen. Instead, the administrative tasks accumulated. More coordination, more scheduling, more formatting. David began asking me to handle his expenses and receipts, to schedule his meetings with clients, his travel, his appointments. Work that was, functionally, executive assistant work. When I finally raised my concerns with David directly, in a carefully prepared conversation where I'd outlined my desire to return to client-facing work, where I'd presented a proposal for how I might transition some of my administrative responsibilities to others, he listened with that same careful attention he always demonstrated. He nodded at appropriate moments. He asked clarifying questions. He said, "I hear you, Emily. I really do. Let me think about how we can create more growth opportunities for you within the current structure." 2 weeks later, he announced a new senior analyst position, strategic culture advisor, exactly the kind of role I'd been developing expertise in for years, and hired someone from outside the firm to fill it. That was when I started drafting my resignation letter. I gave 4 weeks' notice, longer than the 2 weeks required by my contract. I wanted to leave things in good shape. I had never been the kind of person who burned bridges, who left chaos in her wake. I wanted to be professional. I wanted people to remember me well. I spent those 4 weeks training my replacement, a woman named Laura Carter, who'd been hired a month earlier, initially for a junior analyst role. She was competent, eager, younger than me by nearly a decade. She asked good questions. She picked things up quickly. She thanked me often for my patience, for my willingness to share my knowledge. David praised my professionalism during my final weeks. "This is the right move for you, Emily," he said more than once. "You're too talented to stay in a role that doesn't challenge you. You need to be somewhere that can offer you real growth, real advancement. We're just not structured to provide that right now." I nodded. I agreed. I felt mature, clear-headed, self-aware. I was making a choice. I was taking control of my career. On my last day, Robert Anderson took me to lunch at the Italian place 3 blocks from the office. He ordered wine, even though it was midday, a gesture that felt ceremonial. He thanked me for my 9 years of service. He said I'd been instrumental in the firm's growth, that some of our most successful client relationships existed because of work I'd done. He said he was sorry to see me go, but understood that I needed to follow my own path, pursue opportunities that aligned with my ambitions. "You'll always be part of the Anderson-Mitchell family," he said as we stood to leave. "Keep in touch. Let me know where you land." I left feeling respected, appreciated, like I'd made a mature, self-directed choice that everyone understood and supported. For the first month after I left, I felt primarily relief. The pressure was gone. The daily dread I'd been carrying, the feeling of walking into the office and not knowing what I was supposed to be doing, who I was supposed to be, had lifted. I slept better. I had time to think, to breathe, to remember what I actually wanted from my career. I updated my resume, though it was harder than I expected to articulate what I'd been doing in that final year. I reached out to old contacts from graduate school, from previous projects, from conferences I'd attended. I started looking at other firms, other opportunities. But the job search was harder than I'd anticipated. 9 years at one company was supposed to be an asset, but most of that time blurred together when I tried to describe it. In my recent work, the past year and a half was mostly administrative. When interviewers asked what I'd been doing lately, what projects I'd led, what client impact I'd had, I didn't have good answers, not recent ones. My client-facing work was years out of date. The culture expertise I'd developed had been rendered invisible by the administrative role I'd ended up in. On paper, I looked like someone whose career had stalled out, whose ambition had waned, who had settled into a support role. That wasn't the story I wanted to tell. But it was the story my resume told. I kept my growing anxiety private. My friend said I'd land something soon, that someone with my experience wouldn't struggle for long. My sister said I deserved a break anyway, that I'd been working nonstop for years, and maybe this was an opportunity to figure out what I really wanted. My mother said maybe I should consider a career change entirely, that consulting had never seemed like the right fit for me anyway, that maybe this was the universe telling me something. Everyone in my life treated my resignation like an achievement, like evidence of self-awareness and courage. No one questioned it. No one suggested that maybe I hadn't actually chosen it. It was 2 months after I left that I started seeing the LinkedIn updates that made something cold settle in my stomach. Laura. Carter had been promoted. Senior analyst, the title appearing on her profile with a little celebration animation. The same title I'd been working toward for 2 years, the title that had supposedly been unavailable, that the firm supposedly wasn't structured to provide. Then I saw that Megan Foster had been promoted. She'd joined the firm 6 months before I resigned, hired into an entry-level analyst role. Now she was a project lead, managing a major client engagement for a national education nonprofit. Then I saw Stephanie Bennett. She'd been hired 2 weeks before I left, brought on as a junior consultant. Now she was coordinating a major client engagement, specifically the kind of culture assessment work I used to do, the expertise I'd spent years developing. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, scrolling back through the firm's updates, going month by month through the past year. David Sullivan had hired 5 people in the 8 months before I resigned. 3 of them had been promoted within 6 months of starting. None of them had spent time doing administrative work. None of them had been asked to coordinate travel or format presentations or manage David's expense reports. All of them were now doing work I used to do, or work I should have been doing. I called Rachel, a former colleague who'd left the firm about a year before I did. We'd stayed in loose touch, occasional emails, likes on each other's social media posts, that sort of thing. She'd moved to a smaller consulting group, one that focused exclusively on arts organizations. The last time we'd talked, she'd said she was happier, that the work felt more meaningful. "Do you remember why you left?" I asked after we'd exchanged pleasantries about her new role, my job search, the weather. There was a pause on the line, a quality of silence that felt weighted, deliberate. "You mean the official reason, or the real one?" "The real one," Rachel exhaled, a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. David asked me to take on scheduling and coordination for the new team he was building. He said it was temporary, that he needed someone who understood the firm's culture and processes to help integrate the new staff. He made it sound important, essential even. "How long did the temporary assignment last?" 3 months. And then I realized he was hiring people into the roles I used to do, client-facing roles, strategic roles, and paying them more than he was paying me. I asked for a meeting to talk about my trajectory, about when I'd be transitioning back to client work. He said he'd get back to me with some thoughts. Did he? No. He never brought it up again. And every time I tried to raise it, he had a reason why it wasn't the right time to have that conversation. We were in the middle of a big pitch. We were short-staffed. We needed to get through the current quarter first. There was always a reason. I felt something, cold, settling in my chest, spreading outward. "Did you resign, or did he push you out?" "I resigned," Rachel said. "But I didn't actually write the letter until I knew he wasn't going to give me another option. Until staying had become so untenable that leaving was the only thing that made sense." "Did he ever tell you that you were being too sensitive, that you were overreacting?" "Not in those exact words, but yes. He had this way of making you feel like your concerns were your problem, not his. Like if you were frustrated or unhappy, it was because you weren't being flexible enough, weren't being a team player." I was quiet for a moment. "How many other people left around the same time you did?" "I don't know exactly. A few, I think. Maybe more. Why?" "I'm starting to think there was a pattern." I started going back through old emails. Not because I was looking for something specific at first, just because I needed to see the timeline with my own eyes, needed to understand how things had shifted. David's messages to me had changed over time in ways I hadn't noticed while it was happening. Early on, he'd included me in strategy discussions, asked for my input on client work, ceased me on high-level decisions about firm direction. The emails had questions. "What do you think about this approach? How would you recommend we position this to the client? Can you take the lead on developing this framework?" Then gradually the emails shifted. More requests for logistical support, fewer invitations to meetings, fewer questions about strategy, More phrases like, "I'll handle this one," and "Let me take the lead here," and "I think it makes sense for me to be the primary contact on this." By the time I resigned, most of his emails to me were task assignments. Can you schedule this meeting? Can you compile these documents? Can you format this presentation? Can you coordinate travel for the site visit? I found an email thread from 8 months before I left. I'd proposed a new framework for client culture assessments, something I'd been developing for months based on patterns I was seeing across our engagements. It was substantial, a methodology for understanding informal power structures and communication patterns that traditional organizational charts missed entirely. I'd written a 12-page draft document, included case examples, created templates. David had responded enthusiastically. "This is really strong work, Emily. Exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. I'd love to discuss this further and figure out how we can implement this across our client work." I'd waited for that discussion to be scheduled. It never was. 3 months later, I found another email. David presenting a new framework to the entire team. "I've been developing an approach to culture assessment that I think will significantly enhance our client work." I opened the attachment. It was my framework, my structure, my language, my examples barely modified. He'd presented it as his own work. He hadn't credited me. He hadn't even mentioned me. And no one had questioned it. Why would they? David was the director of operations. He was the one with the fancy credentials, the experience at the big firm. Of course, he'd developed a new framework. That's what directors did. I sat staring at my computer screen, feeling something that wasn't quite anger yet. Disbelief, maybe. Or the space just before anger, where you're still trying to find an explanation that makes the betrayal make sense. I didn't tell anyone what I was discovering. Not yet. I wasn't even sure what I was discovering, or if I was just being paranoid, rewriting history through the lens of my current frustration with my job search. Maybe David had genuinely thought the framework was a collaborative effort. Maybe he'd forgotten I'd developed it. Maybe I was seeing malice where there was only carelessness. But I couldn't stop looking. I found the job postings for the positions that had been filled while I was still at the firm. The senior analyst role, the project lead role, the client engagement coordinator role. All of them had been posted externally on the firm's website and on job boards. None of them had been circulated internally. None of them had been mentioned in team meetings. I'd never seen the postings. I'd never been told they existed. I'd never been given the chance to apply, to express interest, to position myself as a candidate. David had hired from outside while I was still there, still doing administrative work that he'd said was temporary, still waiting for the growth opportunities he'd said he was thinking about creating for me. I thought about the conversations I'd had with David in those final months, how he'd framed my concerns, how he'd responded to my frustration. "I want to protect your time, Emily. You're stretched thin. Let me take some of this off your plate. You're too valuable to lose on low-level client work. I need you focused on the internal systems that keep us running. Let me think about how we can create growth opportunities for you. I want to make sure we get this right." Every response had sounded like care, like investment. He was on my side, working on my behalf, looking out for my interests. But nothing had ever changed, except that I'd stopped asking, stopped pushing, stopped expecting anything different. And then I'd resigned. By choice. I called another former colleague, Nicole, who'd left about 6 months before me. She'd been at the firm for 7 years, had been a senior analyst before she left. We'd worked together on several projects early in our tenure, though we drifted into different specializations over time. "Did David ever reassign your client work?" I asked after we'd caught up briefly. "Yeah," Nicole said slowly. "He said he wanted to develop the junior staff, give them more exposure to client-facing work. He said I should focus on internal process improvement for a while, that it would strengthen the firm's infrastructure." "Did you want to focus on internal process improvement?" "Not really, but he made it sound important, essential." "Did you get another client-facing role after that?" "No." "Did you ask for one?" I did, multiple times. He said he'd look into it, that he wanted to find the right opportunity. Then he hired someone new from outside to fill a strategic role that I would have been perfect for. And then you resigned. And then I resigned, Nicole confirmed. Why are you asking about this, Emily? How many people left while David was restructuring the firm? Nicole was quiet for a long time. I could hear background noise on her end, traffic maybe, or wind. She must have been outside. 6, I think, maybe 7. I haven't really counted. How many of them were women? Another pause, longer this time. All of them, Nicole said finally. Why? I'm starting to see a pattern. I pulled up the firm's LinkedIn page and started making a systematic list. Everyone who'd left in the 2 years since David Sullivan had joined. Rachel Morrison, Nicole Davis, Danielle Wright, Allison Hayes, Victoria Brooks, Rebecca Lynn, me, 7 women, 7 resignations, all of them voluntary, officially, all of them within an 18-month period. I started looking at what we'd all been doing before we left. Rachel had been reassigned from client work to coordination. Nicole had been moved to internal process work. Danielle had been asked to focus on training new staff. Allison had been transitioned to administrative support, temporarily. Victoria had been managing schedules and logistics. Rebecca had been doing operations work. All of us had been senior enough to matter. All of us had had real expertise, real client relationships. All of us had been reassigned to lower-level work before we left. And all of us had resigned voluntarily without raising complaints, without making accusations. We'd all left quietly, professionally, with resignation letters that talked about growth and alignment and new opportunities. And all of us had been replaced, not with equivalent hires, but with people who were paid less, who were younger, who didn't question the restructuring because they had no memory of how things had been before. I didn't have proof, not the kind that would hold up in any formal process. I had emails, patterns, observations. I had a list of departures and a timeline of reassignments. I had my own experience and the experiences of women I'd talked to. But I didn't have David saying explicitly, I'm going to push out all the senior women. I didn't have documents outlining a strategy. I didn't have smoking gun evidence. I just had a pattern that was impossible to ignore once you saw it. I thought about going to Robert Anderson, but Robert had been there the whole time. Robert had watched 7 women leave in 18 months and done nothing. Robert had praised David's leadership, his efficiency, his ability to professionalize the firm. If Robert didn't see the pattern, it was because he didn't want to. I spent a week writing out everything I knew, every email I could find, every conversation I could remember with enough detail to document, every timeline of reassignments and departures and new hires. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just needed it to exist outside of my own head, to be real and documented and undeniable. The document grew to 40 pages, then 50, then 60, and then I found the salary data. It was public, technically. The firm had filed a diversity and equity report with the state as part of a grant application for a workforce development program. The report included anonymized compensation bands by role and tenure, broken down by gender. The senior analysts hired under David's tenure, all of whom were men, I noted, were making 15 to 20% more than I'd been making in my last year at the firm. Despite having less experience, despite shorter tenure, despite, in some cases, having fewer credentials. Laura Carter, my replacement, was making what I'd made in my 6th year at the firm, not my 9th. The salary inequity wasn't subtle, it was structural. I sent an email to David Sullivan. The subject line was, "Follow-up on my departure." The body was 3 sentences. I've been reflecting on my time at the firm and the circumstances around my resignation. I'd like to discuss some concerns I have about how my role evolved in the months before I left, and about patterns I've observed regarding departures and compensation. Would you be available for a call this week? I sent it from my personal email at 10:47 p.m. on a Wednesday night. I didn't expect a response until the next day at the earliest. He responded at 2:34 a.m. Emily, of course. I'm glad to hear from you. I've been wondering how you've been doing. How about Thursday at 2 p.m.? I didn't actually want to call. What I wanted was for David to know that I was asking questions. I wanted him to feel what I'd felt, the slow realization that the ground beneath you isn't solid, that the narrative you've been believing isn't true. But I took the call. David's voice when he answered was warm, familiar. The voice of someone who'd been my colleague, my supervisor, someone I'd trusted. "Emily, it's good to hear from you. How are you? How's the job search going?" "It's going," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I've had some time to think about things, about my last year at the firm. I'm sure it's been a period of transition. Those are always challenging." "It has. I've also been talking to some of the other women who left around the same time I did." A pause, short but present. "Oh?" "Rachel, Nicole, Danielle. We've been comparing notes." "I'm glad you're all staying connected," David said, his tone still, warm, still steady. "It's hard when good people move on, but it sounds like you're building a nice network of former colleagues." "It's interesting," I said. "We all had very similar experiences before we left." "Well, restructuring is always difficult. Change affects everyone differently. Some people thrive in it, some people find it challenging. It's natural. It seems like it affected women and men pretty differently." Another pause, this one longer. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel him recalibrating. "Emily, I'm not sure I follow." 7 women left in 18 months, David, all of them senior. All of them with significant expertise and client relationships. All of them reassigned to lower-level administrative or support work before they resigned. And all of them were replaced by younger, less experienced hires, mostly men, who were promoted within months of starting. Silence. "That's a pattern," I said. "Emily." His voice had changed. Still calm, still controlled, but colder now. The warmth was gone. "I understand that you're frustrated with how things ended, but the firm was evolving. We were professionalizing our systems, creating clearer structures. People make their own choices about whether to evolve with an organization or to pursue other opportunities. Did we make those choices, or did you engineer them? I don't appreciate that insinuation. I don't appreciate being managed out of a job I was good at and then being told it was my decision. That's not what happened, Emily. You made a choice. You wrote a resignation letter. You handed it to me. No one forced you to do that. You made staying impossible. You systematically removed everything that made the job worth doing, reassigned me to work that was beneath my skill level, ignored my requests to return to client-facing roles, and then acted like I was choosing to leave when I finally couldn't take it anymore. That's not how I remember it." "Of course it isn't," I said. "That's the whole point." I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From anger. Clean, clarifying anger that felt like waking up after months of fog. He'd done it deliberately. He'd isolated me, undermined me, reassigned me, and then he'd let me think it was my choice to leave. He'd let me believe I was making a mature, autonomous decision while he was systematically engineering my departure. And he'd done it to 6 other women before me. And he'd gotten away with it, because we'd all left quietly, professionally, without making accusations or raising complaints or calling attention to the pattern. I called a lawyer the next morning. Her name was Jennifer Morris, and she specialized in employment discrimination and workplace rights. I'd found her through an online search, chosen her because her website talks specifically about hostile work environments and constructive discharge. Terms I'd been learning meant situations where employees are forced out without being explicitly fired. I laid out everything I had: the emails, the timelines, the salary data, the pattern of departures, the reassignments, the framework David had taken credit for, the external hiring for positions I'd never been told about. Jennifer listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "This is a hostile work environment claim," she said finally. "Possibly constructive discharge. The pattern is compelling. The salary disparities are concerning. The appropriation of your work is problematic. But it's all circumstantial. Do you have any direct evidence that David Sullivan intended to push you out? Any emails where he says something explicitly discriminatory? Any witnesses to statements that show bias? No. Any documentation showing he treated men and women differently in explicitly equivalent roles? Just the salary data. And the fact that every senior woman left while he was hiring and promoting junior men. Jennifer sighed. It wasn't a dismissive sound, more sympathetic. Tired. It's not nothing, Emily. The pattern is there, but it's not enough for a strong lawsuit. You'd need more. A paper trail showing clear intent, testimony from current employees willing to go on record, something explicit that a judge or jury could point to and say definitively, this is discrimination. So there's nothing I can do. I didn't say that. I said a lawsuit would be difficult and expensive and uncertain, but there are other ways to apply pressure, other ways to create accountability. Jennifer suggested I file a complaint with the state labor board. It wouldn't result in a financial settlement, but it would trigger an investigation. The firm would have to respond. They'd have to produce records, employment files, compensation data, documentation of the restructuring process. And if the investigation found evidence of a pattern, it would go on the firm's record. Future complaints would have context. Future employees would have precedent. It's not justice, Jennifer said. Not in the sense of you getting compensated for what happened to you, but it's visibility. It's accountability. And sometimes visibility is enough to make people change their behavior, or at least to make it harder for them to continue the same patterns. I filed the complaint that afternoon. It took 2 hours to complete the online form, attaching documents, writing out the narrative of what had happened, describing the reassignments, the salary disparities, the pattern of departures, explaining how I'd been constructively discharged, forced out through deliberate undermining rather than explicit termination. When I submitted it, I felt something shift. Not relief exactly, but a sense of having done something, having refused to let the pattern continue unchallenged. The labor board investigation took 6 weeks to begin officially. I didn't hear anything from the firm during that time. I assumed David didn't know yet about the complaint. Or maybe he did and was waiting to see what I'd do next, whether I'd escalate further or whether this would be the end of it. I didn't wait. I reached out to the other women, Rachel, Nicole, Danielle, Allison, Victoria, Rebecca. I told them what I'd found. I showed them the timelines, the salary data, the pattern. I told them about the labor board complaint. 3 of them wanted nothing to do with it. They'd moved on. They had new jobs. They didn't want to revisit the firm or David or any of it. They didn't want to be involved in anything that might affect their current positions or future opportunities. I understood. I didn't push. But 4 of them were angry. Rachel said, I knew something was wrong, but I thought it was just me. I thought I was being too sensitive or not adaptable enough. Nicole said, I blamed myself for not being more assertive, for not pushing back harder. I thought if I'd been stronger, things would have been different. Danielle said, I want to burn that fucking place down. Rebecca said, what do you need from us? We compiled everything. Every email we could find, every reassignment we could document, every performance review, every conversation we could remember with enough detail to be credible. We cross-referenced the timelines, who left when, who was hired when, who got promoted when. We documented the hires David had made, the promotions he'd given, the salary discrepancies we could access through various public filings, and through what we'd known about each other's compensation when we'd been at the firm. It was damning. Not legally conclusive, maybe. Jennifer had been clear about that, but morally indefensible. The pattern was too consistent, too systematic, too deliberate to be coincidence or accident. Nicole said, what are we going to do with this? I didn't know yet, but I knew I wasn't going to let it disappear. The labor board contacted the firm in early June. I got a copy of their initial inquiry letter. It was part of the process, giving complainants visibility into the investigation. The letter was formal, procedural, non-inflammatory. It simply stated that a complaint had been filed alleging gender-based discrimination and constructive discharge, and requested that the firm produce records related to my employment, my resignation, and the firm's restructuring process during the relevant period. David called me 2 days later. His number came up on my phone at 4:17 p.m. on a Thursday. I almost didn't answer. Then I decided I wanted to hear what he'd say. Emily, I just heard about the labor board complaint. Okay. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'd really like to talk this through with you, clear up any confusion. There hasn't been a misunderstanding, David. I think there has. You've clearly been going through a difficult time with your job search, and I think that's affecting how you're interpreting what happened at the firm. I'd like to resolve this without escalating further. Can we meet in person, have a conversation? No. Emily, I'm trying to be reasonable here. I'm trying to give you an opportunity to... To what? To withdraw my complaint? To pretend this didn't happen? This is going to hurt the firm. It's going to hurt Robert. It's going to hurt people who had nothing to do with your departure. Good people who are just trying to do meaningful work. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you systematically pushed out every senior woman on your team. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, harder. You're making a serious accusation, Emily, one that could have legal implications. I'm stating facts, David. 7 women left in 18 months, all of them senior, all of them reassigned to administrative work before they resigned, all of them replaced by less experienced hires who were paid more and promoted faster. That's not an accusation, that's a pattern. That's your interpretation of normal personnel changes. Then I'm sure the labor board investigation won't find anything concerning. He hung up. I got an email from Robert Anderson the next day. Emily, I've heard about the labor board complaint. I'm disappointed that you felt you couldn't come to me directly with your concerns. I've always valued your contributions to the firm, and I'd like to find a way to resolve this amicably. Would you be willing to meet? I'd really like to understand your perspective on what happened. I stared at the email for a long time before I responded. Robert, I appreciate the outreach. But if you'd valued my contributions, you would have noticed when David systematically removed me from client-facing work and reassigned me to administrative tasks. You would have noticed when 7 senior women left in 18 months. You would have asked why. You didn't. That tells me everything I need to know about how much you valued my contributions, or any of our contributions. I didn't get a response. The labor board investigation expanded over the following weeks. They requested records for all employees who left the firm in the past 3 years. They requested compensation data for all staff, broken down by role, tenure, and gender. They requested performance reviews, documentation of the restructuring process, records of internal job postings and promotions. The firm hired a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, a partner at a large corporate defense firm that specialized in employment litigation. I knew this because the lawyer's name started appearing on all communications from the firm to the labor board. That told me everything I needed to know. If there was nothing to hide, they wouldn't need a defense attorney with rates that probably started at $500 per hour. In mid-July, I got a call from a journalist. Her name was Stephanie Morris, and she wrote for a local business publication that covered the nonprofit and social enterprise sectors. She'd heard about the labor board investigation through the rumor mill. Someone at the firm had leaked it. She wouldn't tell me who, and she wanted to know if I'd be willing to talk. I can't promise we'll run a story, she said. I'd need to do more reporting, talk to other people, verify the information. But if there's a pattern here, if this is a real issue and not just a disgruntled employee making accusations, then it's worth investigating. I met her at a coffee shop in a neighborhood neither of us lived in. I brought printed copies of everything: timelines, emails, salary data, the list of departures. She went through it all methodically, taking notes, asking careful questions. This is compelling, she said finally. But I'll need corroboration. Can you connect me with the other women who left? I called Rachel, Nicole, Danielle, and Rebecca that evening. I explained about the journalist, about what she was investigating. 3 of them agreed to talk to Stephanie on the record. Rebecca wanted to remain anonymous, but was willing to provide background information. The article ran in late August. The headline was, Pattern of Senior Women Departures Raises Questions at Anderson Mitchell Consulting. It was careful, measured, appropriately cautious. It didn't accuse David Sullivan of breaking the law, It didn't make claims it couldn't substantiate. It simply laid out the facts. 7 senior women had left in 18 months, all under similar circumstances, all replaced by less experienced hires. The firm's publicly available compensation data showed disparities. A labor board investigation was ongoing. The article included quotes from Rachel, Nicole, and Danielle, each describing their experiences in their own words. It included a statement from the firm's lawyer. Anderson Mitchell Consulting is committed to fostering an inclusive workplace and maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct. We are cooperating fully with the Labor Board investigation and are confident that review of the facts will demonstrate our commitment to fair and equitable treatment of all employees. David Sullivan had declined to comment. Robert Anderson's statement read, "We are cooperating fully with the investigation and remain committed to fostering an inclusive workplace where all employees can thrive." The article didn't go viral. It wasn't picked up by national media. It didn't destroy the firm or end David Sullivan's career. But it was public. It was searchable. It was permanent. Anyone Googling the firm or David's name would find it. Any potential employee would see it. Any potential client would read it. Within a week, 2 current employees reached out to me. Both women, both saying they'd been reassigned in the past 6 months. Both saying they'd been told it was temporary, that David needed them to focus on internal work for a while, that it was important, essential. Both saying they were afraid to speak up because they'd seen what happened to the women who'd left. I told them to document everything, every email, every conversation, every change to their responsibilities. I told them they weren't crazy. I told them the pattern was real. I told them they had options. One of them resigned a month later. The other filed her own labor board complaint. The firm's investigation concluded in October, 6 months after I'd filed the original complaint. The labor board's finding was careful, legalistic, appropriately cautious. They found insufficient evidence of intentional discrimination, but noted patterns of concern regarding gender disparities in compensation and advancement opportunities. They noted that the firm's restructuring process appeared to have had a disproportionate impact on senior women employees. They recommended that the firm conduct an internal equity audit, implement stronger oversight of personnel decisions, and establish clear processes for internal promotions and professional development. It wasn't a finding of guilt, but it wasn't an exoneration either. It was public record, it was permanent, it was part of the firm's official history now. Jennifer called me when the report came out. "It's not nothing, Emily. They're on notice now. If this happens again, if another pattern emerges, the next investigation will be a lot harder on them. They won't be able to claim ignorance or coincidence." "So that's it?" "That's it," she said. "Unless you want to pursue a civil lawsuit, which I still wouldn't recommend given the evidentiary challenges." "No," I said, "I don't want a lawsuit." What I wanted was for David Sullivan to face consequences. What I wanted was for him to lose his job, his reputation, his ability to do this to anyone else. But what I got was a labor board report that noted patterns of concern and made recommendations the firm wasn't legally required to follow. I thought about fighting harder, filing a civil suit despite Jennifer's advice, going to a bigger publication, trying to get national attention, making enough noise that someone couldn't ignore it. But I was tired, and I'd already done what I needed to do. David Sullivan's name was now tied to a labor investigation. The firm's reputation had a crack in it that would never fully heal. The women who came after me would have a record to point to, a pattern to cite, evidence that they weren't imagining things or being too sensitive. That wasn't justice, but it was something. I got a job in November, 9 months after I'd resigned from Anderson Mitchell. It was at a smaller firm, less prestigious, with fewer high-profile clients. But the work was real, client-facing, strategic, the kind of work I'd been doing before David Sullivan decided I wasn't worth keeping in that role. My new boss was a woman named Christine Yang. She'd built the firm from nothing 10 years ago, grew it slowly and deliberately. On my first day, she took me to lunch at a Thai restaurant near the office. I read the article about Anderson Mitchell, she said after we'd ordered. My stomach dropped. Okay. I'm glad you filed that complaint, Christine said. A lot of people wouldn't have. They would have just moved on, tried to forget about it. It didn't change anything, not really. It changed something, Christine said. It made it harder for them to do it again without people noticing. It created a record. That matters. I didn't hear from David Sullivan again. I didn't hear from Robert Anderson. The firm continued operating. David continued leading the operations team. The restructuring he'd started continued. But the pipeline of senior women leaving slowed. Whether that was because there were no senior women left to push out, or because someone was actually paying attention now, I didn't know. I didn't particularly care. In January, almost a year after I'd resigned, I got a message on LinkedIn from Laura Carter, my replacement. Hi, Emily. I hope you're doing well. I wanted to reach out because I've been thinking about something, and I'm not sure who else to ask. Do you have time for a quick call? I almost didn't respond. I didn't owe her anything. We weren't friends. She'd benefited from the position I'd been forced out of. But I wrote back. Sure. When works for you? We scheduled a call for the following afternoon. Laura sounded nervous when she answered. I'm sorry to bother you, she said. I didn't know who else to talk to about this. What's going on? Did David ever tell you that your role was evolving? I felt something cold slide through me. Yes. He's been telling me the same thing. For the past 3 months, he says he needs me to focus on internal coordination, that it's essential for the firm's growth, that it's temporary. But it's been 3 months and nothing has changed. And I've noticed that he hired someone new last month, a guy named Kevin, and Kevin is already doing client work, the kind of work I used to do. I was quiet for a moment. Have you asked David about getting back to client-facing work? I have. He says he's thinking about it, that he wants to find the right opportunity, but he never follows up. And every time I try to bring it up again, he has a reason why now isn't the right time to have that conversation. Laura, I'm going to send you something. It's documentation of what happened to me and 6 other women at the firm. I want you to read it, and then I want you to decide whether you think your role is actually evolving or whether you're being managed out. Managed out? Pushed toward resigning without being explicitly fired. She was quiet for a long time. I've been thinking about resigning, she said finally. I've been thinking maybe I'm just not a good fit for the firm anymore, that maybe I'm not flexible enough or adaptable enough. That's what he wants you to think, I said. That's how this works. He makes staying unbearable, and then he lets you think leaving was your choice. I sent Laura every document I had, every email, every timeline, every piece of evidence. I sent her Jennifer Morris's contact information. I sent her the labor board report. I sent her the article that had run in the business publication. I wrote, "You don't have to resign, but if you do, make sure it's actually your choice. Make sure you're not just doing what he's engineered you to do." She responded an hour later. Thank you. I mean that. Thank you. I didn't ask what she decided. It wasn't my business anymore. But 2 months later, I saw that Laura had left the firm. And a month after that, I saw that Megan Foster, one of the women who'd been promoted after I left, had been reassigned to administrative coordination. The pattern was still running. David Sullivan was still David Sullivan. He was still doing what he'd always done, just more carefully now, more slowly, with more documentation to cover himself. But now there was a record. Now there were women who knew what to look for. Now there were complaints, articles, investigations. Now there was a history that couldn't be erased. It wasn't enough to stop him, but it was enough to make him work harder, enough to make it visible, enough to make it possible for the next woman to see the pattern before she wrote her resignation letter. Enough to make her question whether the choice was really hers. I don't think about the firm much anymore. I don't spend time imagining consequences that will never come. I don't fantasize about David Sullivan losing his job or his reputation or facing some dramatic reckoning. but sometimes I think about the word choice. How David had framed my departure. How I'd framed it to myself for months after I left. By choice. I decided it was time to move on. I chose to pursue other opportunities. That was true in the narrowest technical sense. I wrote the letter. I dated it. I signed it. I handed it to David in his office. I walked out of the building on my last day without being escorted, without being fired, without any formal action being taken against me. But David had engineered every condition that made that letter feel inevitable. He'd narrowed my options systematically, deliberately, until resignation looked like the only path that preserved any shred of dignity or autonomy. He'd reassigned me away from the work I was good at, the work I'd trained for. He'd isolated me from client relationships. He'd taken credit for my ideas. He'd hired externally for positions I should have been offered. He'd made it clear, without ever saying it explicitly, that I had no future at the firm in any role I'd want. And then he'd let me believe I'd chosen to leave freely. That was the genius of it. That was why it worked so well. Why he'd done it to 7 women without any of us realizing it was happening. If you can make someone believe their erasure was their decision, they'll never fight back. They'll leave quietly. They'll write professional resignation letters. They'll thank you for the opportunity. They'll tell themselves and everyone else that they're moving towards something better, not running from something intolerable. They'll protect your reputation even as you destroy theirs. I left my job by choice. Only later did I see how carefully that choice had been built. How methodically the ground beneath me had been removed, piece by piece, until I was standing on nothing and the only direction left was down. I resigned because staying had become unbearable. But unbearable wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad luck or poor fit or natural evolution. It was strategy. David Sullivan didn't fire me. He didn't have to. He just made sure that when I left, I'd do it. Quietly. Professionally. With a resignation letter that sounded like maturity and self-awareness and growth. And for months I believed him. I believed the narrative he'd constructed. I believed that I'd made a choice. But belief isn't the same as truth. I don't tell this story as a warning. I don't tell it as a lesson about resilience or speaking up or fighting back. I tell it because it happened, and because I'm not the only one it happened to. And because the next time a woman says, "I left by choice," someone should ask, whose choice was it really? Who built the conditions that made that choice feel inevitable? And who benefits from the fiction that it was freely made? I tell it because patterns don't stop until they're named. And because silence isn't strength, it's just silence. And because some women survive by refusing to stay silent, even when speaking up changes nothing. Even when the consequences they want never come, even when justice remains elusive and partial and incomplete. Some women survive by becoming impossible to ignore, not because it brings them peace, but because it makes the next woman's fight a little bit easier.